Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at a pretty massive stack of historical commentaries.
Oh yeah, definitely a thick stack today.
Right. Exegetical research, theological papers, and it's all focused on this one single, really fascinating ancient document.
Yes, specifically a letter known as 2 Peter.
Exactly. We're looking really closely at chapter 2, verses 1 through 10a. And, this text was written right around AD 63 or 64.
Right in the thick of the first century.
Yeah. And our mission for you today is to explore how this deeply ancient manuscript tackles some, honestly, incredibly modern systemic problems.
Because it really does.
It does. We're going to unpack the mechanics of misinformation, the psychology behind corrupt leadership, and that very human, deeply embedded desire for ultimate justice.
Well, and it's a remarkable piece of literature precisely because of its historical context. I mean, when we look back at the early days of a major movement like the early Christian church, there's this prevailing assumption that it was, an idyllic era.
Oh, for sure. We romanticize it.
Exactly. We imagine this pure, unified group of people just sitting in perfect harmony, right? Before the institutions got all complicated.
Right. The good old days.
But the historical research reveals that the early Christian community in the 60s AD was not just bracing for external persecution from the Roman Empire, they were actually already battling severe internal sabotage.
I always find that contrast so fascinating because the instinct is to build up the walls to keep the enemy out.
Right.
But the dynamic Peter is describing in this letter, it feels less like a traditional invading army and more like a piece of malicious software.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Like it doesn't brute force its way through the firewall. Instead, it attaches itself to a legitimate program, like the church's existing teachings, and quietly rewrites the code from the inside out.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the mechanism at play here. To set the stage, the core conflict Peter addresses revolves around these internal infiltrators.
The false teachers.
Right. False teachers who had quietly embedded themselves within the congregation, and their primary weapon was theological deception.
Which is so insidious.
It is.
Yeah.
Specifically, they were outright denying the second coming of Christ, and, by extension, they were dismantling the entire concept of a future divine judgment.
Which, that fundamentally changes the behavioral algorithm of the entire community.
Absolutely.
Because if you remove the consequence, you completely change the action. But how did these infiltrators actually operate?
Well,
Because if they're a virus rewriting the code,
yeah.
they must have blended in pretty seamlessly with the host, right? What did a false teacher actually look like in AD 64?
Honestly, they look like the most respectable, participating members of the group.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The historical commentaries emphasize that these individuals were not outsiders shouting on a street corner. They were active participants in the community's meals and gatherings.
Oh, hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. But privately, they were introducing what the text translates as damnable heresies.
That's a strong phrase.
It is. And the Greek phrasing implies this sort of gradual side-by-side smuggling of destructive ideas. They went so far as to practically deny the authority of the Lord who bought them.
That brings up a massive question of motive for me.
How so?
Well, why go through the incredible trouble of infiltrating a marginalized, often persecuted religious minority in the first century Roman Empire?
Right, yeah.
It's not like being a Christian in AD 64 was a lucrative career path. What was the end game?
So the exegetical studies point to two primary, historically consistent human motivations.
Okay.
Greed and a desire to legitimize immorality.
Tale as old as time.
Pretty much.
Huh.
And to achieve this, the text notes they used feigned words.
Feigned words.
Yeah. The original Greek word there is plastos.
Wait, is that?
Which is actually where we get the English word plastic.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
Right. They were using molded, fabricated, completely synthetic arguments that were tailored specifically to manipulate their audience.
Plastic words.
Yeah. And the stated goal of these plastic words was to, quote, make merchandise of the congregation.
Make merchandise.
Yes, yes.
That is just a visceral translation.
It really is.
And if we look at the Greek word behind it, emporiomai, right? Which gives us the word emporium.
Yes.
It completely shifts the perspective. It means these leaders weren't just engaging in abstract theological debates. They were actively exploiting people.
Yes.
They saw the congregation not as a community to be served, but as a marketplace to be tapped for personal gain.
And we have to view this through the lens of the first century Greco-Roman world.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, this was a culture built heavily on patron-client relationships. And you had these traveling philosophers who would charge exorbitant fees for their, secret knowledge.
Oh, the ancient grifters?
Precisely. These infiltrators were adapting that societal grift and bringing it right into the church.
Man.
Furthermore, the commentaries draw a direct line between this behavior and the false prophets of the Hebrew Bible.
Like the ones in the Old Testament.
Right, the figures that prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel were constantly battling.
Oh, right.
Those ancient prophets would stand in front of a corrupt king and preach peace and security when they actually should have been warning of imminent disaster.
Just telling people what they wanted to hear.
Exactly. These first-century teachers were running the exact same playbook, offering theological cover for people's worst impulses.
I have a hard time wrapping my head around the congregation's gullibility, though.
What do you mean?
I mean, I understand the mechanics of the grift, but human beings aren't entirely oblivious, are they?
Usually not, no.
If these leaders are so obviously corrupt and they're living visibly immoral lifestyles, why wouldn't the community just expel them?
That's the million-dollar question.
Were they using financial leverage? Or is it simply that their message, that you could do whatever you want without consequence, was just too appealing to reject?
The theological research suggests it is almost entirely the latter.
Really? Just the appeal of no rules?
Yeah. It comes down to cognitive dissonance. You see, a denial of Christ's ultimate authority naturally necessitates a denial of the second coming.
Right, because if he's not in charge, he's not coming back to judge.
Exactly. Now, within the internal logic of early Christianity, the second coming is the ultimate hope for the faithful.
Right.
But for someone wanting to live a purely self-indulgent, exploitative life, the idea of an impartial judge returning to balance the scales is terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. It ruins the whole party.
So, by removing the threat of judgment, you remove the boundaries. It is an incredibly seductive message because it basically tells the listener that their conscience is lying to them.
Wow.
If there's no future accountability, then literally any behavior is justifiable in the present.
It's the ultimate permission slip.
Yes.
It's like saying, you can have your cake, eat it too, and hey, don't worry about the calories, because the concept of calories is a mythological construct designed to control you.
That is precisely it. And because that message is so universally appealing, Peter realizes he cannot just debate them on philosophical grounds.
Philosophy isn't going to cut it against that kind of temptation.
Right. He has to establish a precedent. He has to prove to his audience that the universe actually does have a moral architecture. And he does this by pulling out the historical receipts.
Yeah. He essentially builds a legal brief here.
He really does.
He doesn't just offer an opposing opinion. He constructs an argument using 3 specific historical exhibits from the Hebrew tradition to demonstrate that the divine possesses a very consistent, very undeniable track record of dealing with rebellion.
Yes.
He moves from the angels to the great flood to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah.
And what is brilliant about this sequence is the escalating scale of the example.
The scale, yeah.
Peter starts at the absolute apex of the cosmic order, the spiritual realm. The text argues that God didn't even spare rebellious angels, but cast them down, delivering them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment.
It's fascinating that Peter leans so heavily on the first Enoch narrative here.
Oh, yeah, that always catches people off guard.
Because, for anyone listening who isn't familiar with first-century Jewish literature, First Enoch is a highly influential, non-canonical text from the Second Temple period.
Right, it's not in the standard Bible.
Exactly.
Well,
and it greatly expands on that brief mention in Genesis chapter 6 about the sons of God who rebelled. It details the severe cosmic punishment of those entities.
yes, it gets very descriptive.
But from a strict theological standpoint, does Peter's use of outside non-biblical literature weaken his argument for a religiously conservative audience?
Well, that is a common modern concern, but the historical context completely neutralizes it.
Oh, so.
The commentaries clarify that Peter was simply tapping into the cultural literacy of his time. He wasn't necessarily elevating First Enoch to the level of sacred scripture.
Okay, so it wasn't about making it canon.
No, not at all. He was utilizing a widely understood cultural touchstone to make his point perfectly clear. It would be akin to a modern speaker referencing a well-known piece of classic literature or even a popular film to illustrate a universal truth,
like referencing the Matrix or something.
Exactly. Peter uses the language and imagery his audience already deeply understood to establish his first premise. Even the most powerful spiritual beings in the cosmos are not exempt from justice.
That makes a lot of sense. You speak the dialect of the culture you were trying to persuade.
Exactly.
So Peter establishes that cosmic powers aren't immune. Then he brings the camera down from the heavens to the planetary level with Exhibit B, the Great Flood.
Right, wiping the slate clean.
He points out that the ancient world was swept away. And finally, he narrows the focus even further to a localized societal and economic scale with Exhibit C, Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes.
He notes that these incredibly prosperous cities were turned to ashes as an example to future ungodly generations.
And notice the systematic dismantling of the false teacher's core argument there.
Peter's logic dictates that if cosmic entities, the entire global population, and economically untouchable city-states could not escape the consequences of their corruption, then a handful of grifters in a local congregation certainly will not either.
Bingo.
The message is that the moral arc of the universe might be long, but it inevitably bends toward justice.
Absolutely.
But I have to imagine, if you were sitting in that early church congregation, listening to this letter being read aloud,
It would be intense.
very.
Yeah.
The sheer weight of this argument could feel incredibly terrifying. You have angels in chains of darkness, global cataclysms, and prosperous cities turning to ash.
It's heavy stuff.
It paints a picture of a universe where one wrong move means obliteration. Where is the hope in this theology? I mean, is Peter just delivering a terror tactic to force compliance?
Well, the structure of the text proves otherwise. Kidder's argument is not merely a catalog of doom. It is actually a carefully constructed grammar of hope.
A grammar of hope. I like that.
Yeah, the exegetical studies highlight that Peter is building a complex if-then conditional argument. He strings together 4 distinct if statements based on the history we just discussed.
Okay, let's trace that logic.
Sure. So he argues, 1, if God did not spare the angels. 2, if God did not spare the ancient world. 3, if God turned Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes. And 4, if God delivered righteous Lot.
All those ifs are the setup.
Yes, all of those ifs are the setup for the ultimate resolution in verse 9.
The then statement.
Exactly. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust for punishment.
Wow.
Within the internal logic of the text, the destruction of the wicked is actually the undeniable proof that the divine is entirely capable of rescuing the righteous.
So the same power that brings the gavel down is the power that orchestrates the rescue.
Precisely.
And the specific examples Peter uses for that rescue are incredibly layered. Let's look at Noah first.
Yeah, Noah's an interesting one.
Because the linguistic research points out a fascinating detail here. Peter specifically refers to Noah as the 8th person.
Right.
That feels like such an odd, overly specific mathematical detail to include, unless it serves a deeper literary purpose.
Oh, that phrasing is deeply intentional.
Yeah.
In biblical literature and early Christian thought, the stress on the number 8 is rarely just about a head count. It is a profound symbolic reference to the concept of an 8th day or a new creation.
Oh, I see. Because a standard week has 7 days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, the 8th day represents stepping out of the old cycle and beginning something entirely new.
That's beautiful.
Right. By calling Noah the 8th person, Peter is portraying him stepping off the ark not just as a survivor, but as the preservation of humanity meant to begin a brand new world.
It is a literal fresh start emerging from the wreckage of a corrupt system.
Yes.
But while Noah is a fairly straightforward example of deliverance, I really struggle with the second example, Lot.
Yeah, Lot is tough.
Calling Lot a righteous man feels like a massive historical rewrite on Peter's part.
It really does seem that way at first glance.
Because if we read the original Genesis narrative, this is a guy who made major life choices based on economic greed, right? He willingly pitched his tent toward Sodom.
Yeah.
He offered his own daughters to a violent mob to protect his guests. And his story ends in a cave with horrific incestuous fallout. I mean, how can Peter ethically use this profoundly compromised individual as the poster child for righteousness?
It is arguably the most jarring theological move in the entire letter.
It has to be.
But the research suggests Peter is not whitewashing Lot's history. Instead, this raises a crucial point about how first-century writers viewed the concept of imputed righteousness.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, Peter's focus here is on Lot's internal posture, what
Right.
the text calls his soul being vexed by the filthy conversation or the immoral lifestyle of the culture around him.
So it's less about Lot's flawless execution of morality and more about his baseline internal friction.
Exactly. Even though Lot made terrible, compromised choices about where to live and how to handle crises, the text argues he never fully assimilated into the core ethos of Sodom.
He never got entirely comfortable.
Right. His daily distress over the cruelty and exploitation he witnessed demonstrated that his ultimate allegiance remained tied to the moral framework of his uncle Abraham.
Okay, I can see that.
Furthermore, theological scholars often contrast Peter's approach here with the Book of Jude.
Oh, because they're so similar.
Yes. Jude and Second Peter share a massive amount of overlapping material and were both written to combat false teachers.
Right.
But Jude focuses almost exclusively on the punitive destruction of the wicked. Peter actively supplements that tradition by adding the rescue narratives of Noah and Lot.
He wants to offer a lifeline.
Exactly. He wants to reassure his readers that even in the midst of deeply flawed human existence, deliverance is possible.
So he was surrounded by the rot, and even though he got the mud all over his shoes, he never stopped hating the smell of it.
That's a great way to summarize it.
That is a profound reassurance for a community that feels like it's drowning in deception and wondering if they're going to be swept away with the tide.
It really is.
Which brings us to a really crucial pivot in our deep dive today. We have spent a lot of time analyzing the ancient history, first century, patron-client dynamics, Old Testament floods, ancient cities.
The theory?
Right. But what is the mechanism by which this matters to you, the listener, right now? How do the actions of false teachers or hypocritical leaders in any organization actually impact the wider world today?
Well, the impact is immediate because of how human beings process representation. People do not view institutional corruption in a vacuum.
Right. In fact, one of the commentaries shares a powerful anecdote about a college theology class that illustrates the mechanics of this perfectly.
Oh, the story about the student.
Yes. There was a student in this class who relentlessly made malicious, derisive remarks about one specific Christian denomination. And every single time the professor tried to steer the academic conversation, this student would find a way to verbally attack this particular group.
And the root cause of that hostility was deeply personal, not theological.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It eventually came to light that years prior, the student's father had been severely financially mistreated by a prominent member of the clergy from that exact denomination.
Yeah.
One corrupt act by a person holding religious authority sparked a multi-generational bitterness toward the entire system that leader represented.
It's tragic, but so common.
It is. The underlying mechanism here is that, whether it's fair or not, the public views leaders as the embodiment of the systems they represent. When an insider uses plastic words to make merchandise of people, the ripple effect doesn't just hurt the immediate victims.
No, it spreads.
It damages the credibility of the entire philosophy. As Peter wrote, it causes the way of truth to be evil spoken of.
It creates a structural cynicism that is incredibly difficult to dismantle.
Oh, absolutely.
And that brings us to the most challenging modern application from the text. The concept of being vexed. We analyzed how Lot's righteous soul was distressed daily by the normalization of exploitation in his culture. The psychological challenge for the listener today is to evaluate their own internal sensitivity to corruption.
Basically asking, how numb have we actually become to the things we claim to oppose?
That is the exact metric. Another piece of research highlights a modern story about a prominent pastor who wrote an editorial challenging his audience to stop watching a specific, highly popular television show.
Right.
His argument was that the show egregiously normalized the exact types of exploitation and immorality that their faith explicitly condemned.
And you would assume a religious leader telling his specific community to avoid media that violates their core tenets would be, standard operating procedure.
In theory, yes. But the pastor received a massive vitriolic wave of backlash.
Really?
Yeah, and the pushback didn't come from the secular culture defending artistic freedom. It came from his own congregation.
Wow. From inside the house.
Yes. They were deeply offended that he had attacked their preferred entertainment. The analysis of this event suggests that their comfort and their entertainment had become more sacred to them than their pursuit of a principled life.
They lost their friction.
Exactly. They had lost the capacity to be vexed.
That is a fascinating psychological study. It forces a very direct, uncomfortable question.
It does.
If we can sit and casually consume entertainment or support political rhetoric that completely normalizes the very things that history shows destroy societies, does that mean we have just become callous?
Yeah.
Have we placed ourselves right in the middle of a burning city, set up a lawn chair, and simply gotten used to the heat?
That is the exact tension this ancient letter is trying to force its readers to confront. The text suggests that discomfort, that internal friction when you see exploitation, is vital.
Because if you don't feel it,
Because the moment you stop feeling that distress is the moment you have been entirely assimilated by the culture you thought you were changing.
wow. We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today. Let's synthesize the mechanics of what we've learned here.
Sounds good.
We started with the concept of internal infiltrators, leaders acting like malicious software, using fabricated plastic words and patron-client dynamics to make merchandise of their own communities.
Right.
They weaponize theology to deny future consequences, essentially trying to engineer a society without boundaries.
But then we examine the historical counterargument. From the cosmic rebellion of angels to the planetary reset of the flood to the economic collapse of corrupt cities, the text argues that the moral architecture of the universe demands justice.
Yet the ultimate takeaway of this theology isn't terror. It is the if-then grammar of hope.
Yes.
The premise that if the divine can manage cosmic and global rebellion, then the divine is entirely capable of rescuing the individual out of whatever systemic, rot, or cultural assimilation they find themselves trapped in.
Which is exactly why studying a document from AD 64 is far more than an academic exercise in ancient history. It is a vital framework for critical thinking.
Absolutely.
We live in a digital, hyper-connected world that is absolutely overflowing with voices utilizing synthetic arguments to make merchandise of our attention, our finances, and our votes.
Selling comfort.
Selling comfort, selling excuses, and selling the illusion that consequences do not exist. For Peter's original audience, the theology of an impending impartial judgment was actually a profound source of psychological comfort.
And which is kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
To think of judgment as a comfort.
It is, until you realize what the alternative is.
Yeah.
If ultimate justice does not exist, then the exploitation, the grift, and the corruption we see in the world ultimately win.
Oh, man.
The belief in divine judgment means that the people using plastic words to manipulate the vulnerable will not get the final say. It means that eventually, reality asserts itself and the scales are balanced.
That completely reframes how we process the concept of accountability.
It really does.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the historical and theological mechanics of 2 Peter, I want to leave you with one final thought to process on your own. Throughout this deep dive, we have focused heavily on the deception of others, the false teachers, the corrupt leaders, the grifters making merchandise of the innocent. And it is incredibly satisfying to read an ancient text that promises ultimate impartial justice for those people.
Of course.
We all want the scales to be balanced when we are the ones being exploited. But think about how quickly we demand absolute, uncompromising justice for the leaders and systems that wrong us, yet how desperately we crave grace, nuance, and understanding for our own compromises.
Yeah.
We want fire to fall on the corrupt institutions, but we want infinite patience for our own blind spots. If the ultimate mathematically precise, impartial justice this ancient text describes is actually a reality, are we truly ready for those scales to be perfectly balanced?